Hey everyone, and welcome back. We've got a really fascinating deep dive for you today.
Yeah, this one's going to be a good one.
We're going to be looking at white privilege and transracial identity.
Okay.
So you guys sent in a ton of YouTube videos, Reddit threads, we've got some TikTok comments, even a few scholarly articles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, and I think the big question that we're going to try to answer today is, can a white person claiming a transracial identity actually be exercising white privilege, especially considering black individuals can't just shed their race the same way?
That's a huge question.
Yeah, there's so many layers to unpack here.
For sure, for sure. So where should we start?
Well, something that really caught my eye was this video by Simon Cushing,
Okay.
and he draws a comparison between transitioning genders and transitioning races.
Interesting.
And it kind of got me thinking.
Yeah, I see why that would be a clever comparison.
Yeah,
Because it raises the question, if we accept transgender identities as valid, should the same logic apply to transracial identities?
right. And if not, then why?
Right.
I mean, are they inherently disrespectful? Does choosing to identify as transracial disrespect or minimize the struggles of people who were born into that race?
Yeah, a lot of people bring that up as a concern, but there's a counter argument that I saw in Cushing's video, and even a video titled, oh boy, this is a long one, For Free Doom.
Okay.
And their point is, look, if a transracial individual isn't trying to exploit or misrepresent a race, are they really harming anyone? And it's just like adopting a different appearance. Is that inherently harmful?
I don't know. That's a tough one.
It is a tough one.
It seems like there's a difference between appreciating a culture and claiming to be a part of a race you weren't born into.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think to get at that difference, we have to consider the concept of race itself. And one of the documents you sent, RCTA, Understanding RCTA, and even the Wikipedia article on ethnicity, both highlight this idea of race as a social construct.
Oh, yeah, I read that. So scientifically speaking, it's more about how society categorizes people than a rigid biological category.
Exactly, exactly. And there's actually more genetic diversity within racial groups than between them. This is something that transracial, what does science say, really dives into. So does this understanding of race as a social construct then change how we view the idea of changing one's race?
That's a great question. I'm curious to know what you think. Does knowing that race is largely a social construct, does that make the idea of transracial identity more or less valid in your mind?
That's where things get really complex. But I think to answer that, we need to look at a specific example. Let's take Rachel Dolezal, a case that comes up in a lot of the sources, including Simon Cushing's video and a thesis on transracialism.
Oh, right. Dolezal, she presented as a black woman for years. She was even a chapter leader for the NAACP until her racial identity was questioned.
Right, and she ultimately lost her position because of it. And in one of the sources, a thesis on transracialism, there's this powerful quote. It says, and I quote, Dolezal was always the first to lose her job and get canceled, but never the first to a scholarship.
Wow.
So this kind of suggests this double standard that's at play.
Right. It really makes you think about the privilege inherent in being able to choose to be perceived as black when, like, black people themselves don't have that choice. That's something that Cushing brings up, too, in his video.
He does. It's an important point. Although, to be fair to Cushing, he also acknowledges that there have been black individuals historically who have passed as white to escape oppression.
Oh, right, yeah.
So it's not a totally, like, one-sided thing.
Right, it's complicated.
Yeah. But it definitely adds this extra layer of complexity to Dolezal's case. I mean, was she exercising white privilege? It's hard to say for sure. But it certainly brings up some difficult questions.
It always seems to come back to this question of choice, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, can a white person truly understand what it means to be black if they're choosing that identity rather than living it as their reality?
That is the million-dollar question. And I think to unpack it further, we need to actually hear from people who identify as transracial. And luckily, you sent in some really compelling Reddit threads where people are sharing their personal stories. Black to white transracials, RCTA safe, the dire racial community of Reddit.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
There are some powerful stories in here.
Yeah, some people are very open about their experiences. Like, there's one story of a black woman in Europe who internalized so much racism that she seeks to present as white just because of societal pressures.
All right.
And then there's a Korean individual who wants specific physical features but is really struggling with the ethical implications of that. And then there's this person who loves Japanese aesthetics so much that they've adopted them, but they worry about being disrespectful.
It's so interesting to see such a vast spectrum of experiences within the transracial community.
It really is.
It's not a monolithic group at all.
No. And reading those stories, it just made me think, what do you think about the transracial experience? Like, do these stories make you more or less sympathetic?
That's such a thought-provoking question.
Mm,
It makes you consider the human side of this debate,
absolutely.
and it highlights the importance of listening to these diverse voices and actually trying to understand their perspectives. Which brings us to another interesting point. How do different cultures view race?
Right.
So there's this Wikipedia article on race, human categorization, and it actually compares racial classifications in the U.S. versus Brazil.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that.
So the U.S. has historically had very strict ancestry rules, like the one-drop rule,
Mm.
where essentially any trace of black ancestry made a person black.
Right, right. Whereas in Brazil, they have a much more fluid system that's based on appearance.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder if a system like Brazil's, one that embraces that fluidity, could help ease some of the tension surrounding transracial identity.
Hmm, that's an interesting thought. Would it create more space for people to explore their identities freely?
Or would it create new challenges? I don't know. There are no easy answers here.
Definitely not. And to make things even more complex, we also have to consider the impact of technology.
Oh, right. That's a whole other can of worms.
For sure.
A thesis on transracialism
Yeah.
mentions gene editing, nanotechnology. These are some pretty wild possibilities. Like, could we actually see physical racial transformations in the future?
I mean, it's a fascinating question to think about. If we can change our appearance to align with a different racial group, what does that mean for our understanding of race and identity?
Whoa, yeah. And transracial, what does science say, actually brings up some of the potential downsides too, like cultural appropriation, ethical concerns, even health risks.
Right, there are so many unknowns.
It's a lot to consider,
It is. It seems like this is a conversation that's only going to become more urgent as technology advances.
for sure.
Yeah, we need to be having these conversations now.
Definitely. This is getting really interesting. I'm excited to see where this goes.
Me too. Yeah, it really is a future that raises more questions than answers. And it kind of brings us back to that core issue of white privilege in the context of transracial identity.
You're right. Because even with all these potential advancements, we can't ignore the existing inequalities and the power dynamics that are already in place and that shape how race is experienced.
Absolutely. It's so important to remember that even though race is a social construct, it has very real consequences in our society.
Exactly. So it makes me wonder, even if someone genuinely feels a strong connection to another race, is choosing to identify as that race, even just in appearance, is that inherently benefiting from a system that disadvantages others?
That's a big question. It's about agency and choice, right? For a lot of people of color, especially Black individuals, their race isn't something they can just choose to change or to shed. It's an inherent part of their lives. And it comes with this whole set of social and historical realities that they can't escape.
And like Cushing was saying, a white person choosing to become black could be seen as making light of or even mocking that lived experience.
Right.
Like saying, oh, I can be black when it suits me, but I can always go back to being white if things get tough.
Yeah, it's a valid point, and it's something that we need to address honestly and openly if we're going to have a productive conversation about transracial identity. We have to acknowledge those power dynamics that are at play and how white privilege can really impact these discussions.
There's a comment in the RCTA safe thread that stuck with me.
Yeah.
It was a user who identifies as Chinese, and they were talking about experiencing racism and navigating a world that sees them as other. And they asked, why would you want to abandon your hard work just to go to another culture that's more pretty or that you just get along with better?
It's powerful. It's a powerful reminder that choosing to adopt a racial identity, it's not just about aesthetics or personal preference.
Yeah.
It's about stepping into this really complex web of social and historical realities, and that can have really profound effects on a person's life.
I mean, for some people, that choice might stem from a genuine sense of connection and belonging, right? In the Diracial Community Reddit thread, there was this person who deeply identifies with Japanese culture, and they talked about feeling happier and more accepted when they adopt Japanese aesthetics.
It really highlights the emotional and the psychological aspects of this whole issue. Because for some individuals, their sense of self is deeply intertwined with a racial identity that might not align with their physical appearance or their ancestry.
Yeah, it makes you think about how complex identity can be. Like, who are we to judge another person's deeply held sense of self?
I think the key here is to approach these conversations with empathy and respect, acknowledging those complexities and the nuances of individual experiences, because there is no single answer, right? And just creating space for that thoughtful, compassionate exploration is so important.
Okay, this next point is kind of a mind bender. So we've established that race is socially constructed, but what happens when the social construct itself starts to change?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, societies and cultures are constantly evolving. Our understanding of race is no exception. The categories and the definitions that we use today, they might not be the same ones that we're using in the future.
And that brings us back to technology, right?
Mm.
Because if we're already seeing advancements like gene editing and nanotechnology, who's to say those won't eventually be used to alter physical features that we associate with race?
It's definitely a possibility. And it has huge implications for how we understand race and identity. Like, what would happen if individuals could actually physically transform themselves to align with a different racial category? I mean, what would that mean for the concept of race as we know it?
Right. Will it become even more fluid, or will these technological advancements just reinforce existing social hierarchies and inequalities?
That's a big question. We need to be thinking about this now. The technology is advancing so rapidly that having these open and honest conversations about the ethical and the societal implications of these advancements is crucial.
Totally. It's like with self-driving cars. The technology is basically here, but we're still figuring out the rules of the road.
It's a great analogy. And just like with self-driving cars, we need to be proactive about shaping that ethical framework around these technologies and make sure that they're used responsibly and equitably.
A thesis on transracialism, they bring up another point. Even if people could alter their physical appearance, they might still lack the deeper cultural connections and lived experiences that come with belonging to that racial group.
Right. Like it challenges that whole idea that simply changing your physical appearance is enough to embrace a different racial identity. It really highlights the importance of cultural immersion, understanding, and respect.
And they use the example of K-pop. Someone might be drawn to the aesthetics and the music, but they might not have a deeper understanding of Korean culture and history. And I feel like there's a risk there, right? A risk of fetishization and appropriation.
Absolutely. We have to be so careful about reducing another culture to a set of superficial traits or trends without engaging with its complexity and its nuances.
So speaking of complexities and nuances, there's this video, Let's All Get Past This Confusion About Trans People by Professor Dave Explains. It might seem like a bit of a detour, but I think it's relevant here.
Oh, okay. How so?
Well, it explores the concept of identity more broadly, specifically the distinction between sex and gender.
Okay.
So Professor Dave argues that sex is largely determined by biology, while gender is more of a neurochemical construct. It's still biological, but it's not just about chromosomes.
Right. And that distinction is so important because it highlights that our internal sense of self can actually differ from our physical characteristics.
Exactly. And while the video focuses on transgender identity, I think it raises questions that are relevant to the transracial conversation as well. Because if we accept that gender is this complex and multifaceted aspect of identity, can we apply similar logic to the concept of race?
It's a thought-provoking parallel. It makes you think about self-identification in both transgender and transracial contexts. Like, if we acknowledge that individuals have the right to define their own gender identity, can we extend that same right to racial identity? And where do we draw the line?
Okay, before we get too deep in the philosophical weeds, I want to circle back to the personal stories and lived experiences.
Yeah, because those are often the most powerful and illuminating parts of these conversations.
One story that really stayed with me is from the, quote, Goats podcast episode featuring Martina Big, a German woman who identifies as Black. And she talks about receiving injections to darken her skin. She even believes that she can have a Black baby.
That's a controversial claim. It brings up all sorts of ethical and scientific questions. But it also speaks to how individuals choose to embody their chosen racial identities, even if those choices might not align with traditional understandings of race.
She even mentions that people, even in Germany, ask her how they can become Black too. It's like this is a real phenomenon that's happening across cultures.
Absolutely. It shows that the desire to identify with a different race, it's not limited to a specific location or culture. It's global. And it speaks to a deeper human need for belonging, for connection, and for self-expression.
Martina Big also mentions that she and her partner are considering starting an OnlyFans account to share more of their journey. She's very open about her experiences and her desire to connect with others who might be going through similar things.
It's interesting how technology is enabling individuals to create communities and share their stories in ways that just weren't possible before, you
Oh.
know? Platforms like OnlyFans, Reddit, even TikTok, they're providing these spaces for people to connect and explore their identities, even if those identities might be considered unconventional or controversial.
And even if it might seem a little out there to some folks, I mean, who are we to judge?
It's true. It's not our place to impose our own beliefs or values on others. I think the key is to approach these conversations with an open mind, listening to and learning from the individuals who are living these experiences.
Yeah, it really highlights how much the internet has kind of amplified these conversations and given a platform to so many people who might have felt marginalized or silenced before.
That's true. I mean, it's a powerful tool for connection, for community building, but like any tool, it has its
Oh,
downsides.
for sure. Like the spread of misinformation or online harassment,
Yeah.
it's definitely a double-edged sword. But it's undeniable that this whole transracial identity conversation is happening online in a big way. I mean, just look at all the sources that we've been diving into for this deep dive. We've got a lot here.
Yeah, there's so much interest and debate around this topic, and I think the internet has given people the space to actually have those conversations, for better or for worse.
So we've really explored a lot of different angles, I think. The ethical arguments, the science of race, personal stories, cultural perspectives, the role of technology. That's a lot to process.
It is, it's true. It's definitely not a simple issue with easy answers, but I think by examining all these different facets, by looking at all these different viewpoints, we can at least start to grasp the complexities and the nuances of transracial identity.
And hopefully this deep dive has encouraged everyone to kind of approach these conversations with more empathy and understanding.
Yeah, I agree. The key is to listen and to learn from each other and to acknowledge just how wide that range of experiences and perspectives is within this discussion.
Absolutely. Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one final kind of thought-provoking question, something to chew on, really. So we talk about how race is primarily a social construct and how future technologies might allow us to alter our physical appearance.
Right. And a future like that could totally reshape how we understand race and identity.
So here's the question. If those two things are true, that race is a construct and that physical transformation might be possible, could we see a shift in how society perceives and categorizes race?
Mm-hmm.
Could we see like whole new identities emerge that defy the traditional categories that we have now?
Whoa, that's a big one. It's like you're asking us to imagine a future where our current understanding of race just becomes completely irrelevant.
Mhm.
A future where people have so much more freedom to express their identity in ways that we can't even imagine right now.
It's kind of exciting and a little bit daunting to think about, isn't it?
It is. It is. I think it's a future full of possibilities, positive and potentially challenging. But it's something that we need to be talking about.
I agree. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive for today. We've only scratched the surface of this complex and constantly evolving topic, but hopefully we've given you some food for thought.
And hopefully, we've inspired you to keep exploring and keep forming your own conclusions about this topic as it continues to evolve.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.